Yeah, thank you, Aliki and Charlotte, for this journey, which sparks some optimism, I feel, and yeah, and that how we would imagine our futures in more radical ways, maybe. And so now this moment has come that we are really happy to open the assembly, where we would be happy to hear everyone's thoughts, comments, and ideas on the possibility of creating the IPACC, or on any other of the questions that have been raised by the speakers today, and or that you had in the breakout rooms and you would like to share. And so we have several audiences. We will, similarly as yesterday with Bruno, try to pick up the questions from YouTube and Vimeo, and also from Zoom. But here today, also in Zoom chat, you have a chance to really write that you have a question, and come and also say it with your camera on, and you know, just unmute yourself. And so, yeah, but you can also write the question and we will read it. And I see that Anne has written in the chat like a small protocol how to do it. Yeah, so let's see, do we have some first questions from the audience, or maybe reflections?
You can go. You want to go?
Who would like to go? Is there someone? If not, then I think I will have maybe like a comment, because I was really fascinated and somehow thought a lot about this question that Nataša Petrešin-Bachelez wrote about, like art and public health, and how important can that be in that situation. Because I was also thinking that throughout the pandemic, it has really somehow opened up this question of ecology, like very like starkly, but also like we will have, people are speaking more and more that we will have this second pandemic, which is the pandemic of mental health, that will come of this economic difficulties and social isolation and screen, you know, depression that we've all have started to have. And now, for instance, we are thinking a lot about like how to open the museums and have some kind of like spaces for art, but it's not even safe, you know, for instance, in Latvia. So yeah, I'm wondering like how in the future the art will maybe potentially have this bigger role, and how we kind of, yeah, can really offer something and also not let it be totally marginalized with like closing things down because they are not safe, let's say. So that is just more like a reflection that I have also for this moment. I don't know if maybe Nataša would like to comment something on that.
Thank you, Inga. No, it kind of reminds me of, because when we broke into the rooms, we had a conversation with the Fernando, Suzanne, and Taru, and it kind of reminds me of what you were saying with this fake idea of a safe space that museums are trying to put forth, fake in many ways, some more, some less fake. But we definitely agreed on let's say this exclusivity, and something reflects back to what Fernando was saying. Sorry, my daughter in the next room, you hear her. So what is quite let's say obvious or the problematic with the art is this closeness, the discourse that has been created, that is very inclusive, that is very almost l'art pour l'art itself, and which sometimes tells very little about what we are seeing, perceiving, interacting with. So I think that what I have been trying to say, or where we are observing with the other members of the initiative, the importance of how we do things differently, and the importance of art as a space that can create how to do things differently, and how does this is in a way related to understanding that art is not only what we are seeing in the museums, that there are other practices that have been doing this since centuries, that it's almost like a ritual-based practice. Art is almost like a ritual-based where there are ceremonies, there are appreciations, it's a healing, it's opening the questions can change your mind, so it affects actually your life, it affects also your mental situation, I would say. So in that sense, I didn't say just I didn't say that just to let's say be self-critical, but on the photos that I shared, indeed we are laughing a lot. There is a lot of happy faces there, and we are happy when we get together, and we are happy when we know that we can, with our competencies, do something. For example, for an artist who is a jewelry maker who is waiting to get his status for a refugee in France, in order not to be sent back to Afghanistan where he's from. We organized a photo shoot for him in order to prove that he has a practice here. So we got that kind of things, makes you really feel better. And if I see that very clearly also in how Fernando is talking about his practice, when establishing this very much local-based and grounded communities that support each other through shepherds networks, through agriculture. This is all contributing to certain understanding of well-being, and the climate change is such a moment which is terribly weighing on us, and we feel the necessity to be really meaningful actors right now while we are speaking.
Can I ask a question? I had a really interesting discussion with Ali Clark and Christoph Miller, one of our current Yamvanite participants, in the breakout room. And we were discussing the systems and structures that could potentially strengthen the presence of social sciences, arts, and humanities in scientific processes such as the assessment reports of the IPCC, or even the content that gets assessed in the first place. And I maybe wanted to know more from Fernando and Suzanne, because both of you have experience of creating these institutions, these para-institutions, Fernando with Inland and Suzanne with the grassroots institutions that you've mentioned in your presentation. And I was wondering, what are the methods of translation that or the strategies for translation between, the type of language and the type of data that an art practice can give can bring to the table, and how does that get communicated or intersected with or cross-pollinated with a more hard fact-based scientific contribution, or even in the frontline communities, the type of language and the type of questions that they put on the table. So yeah, maybe a question about methods of translation and communication, and also how does that reverberate on institutional structures and modes of working?
Yeah, sure. I can start. So I think one of the big parts of that is grounding everything in lived experience and testimony. So for instance, with the tar sands, we spent a lot of time documenting and interviewing, sometimes just talking head style documentation of the changes to the landscape and the lived experience of ecocide. And a lot of the time we would use that when we were going to shareholders to talk about the risk involved in the projects and the human rights abuses. So that was a way to translate something like financial risk that's associated with these projects, which is actually going to make the corporations care. They don't care about climate change or human rights violation, but they care about risk. So we often translated the free prior informed consent of rights being violated into this risk language, and also project stoppages. So when Indigenous communities stop a pipeline, that turns into costs on your pipeline. which means that your project can become financially unviable. So we're constantly moving between this language of lived experience of the into risk language. So I think that's one big one for how divestment has been really important. And then the other thing is to constantly, so I kind of think of what I do sometimes is like alchemy, and you're constantly looking at what is the form. So, you know, we move between podcast, if that's to communicate to the communities back home, what's happening at the COP as well. So I think that's why partnerships and having those relationships with different forms of media is really important. And then I think also sometimes resisting translation as well, to hold the ground and to say, actually, no, I'm going to hold the ground and I'm going to talk about the spiritual impacts of this. And that's where the decolonization happens. And that was very powerful, I think, with the tar sands, where we said, no, we're going to call it tar sands, even though you call it oil sands. We're going to shift the language. So I'm going to end with that, just thinking about when do you translate and when do you hold the ground to shift the narrative as well. So I'll pass to Fernando.
Thank you, Suzanne, but actually I couldn't add much more, because I think you pointed right. The lived experience and the immersion is what will allow to find like a common ground in which to find a common language. But we are still experimenting and testing. It's not at all like something you just find out and reach in a short time. So it's the whole process of landing and rooting, and then find that common language, especially with the communities around, that I find more difficult. When I've worked with the scientific community, it hasn't been so difficult to translate into artistic formats, things we have been working with, and then they sometimes found it interesting or funny, or they reminded them something else. So yes, I guess that then it should have some value, but then the question of how that would, or how that effectively influences the existing structures, it's hard to answer in a global sense, because that's very much like case by case. I'm trying to think on examples, but yes, it's very hard, because they are the structures are like ways of doing that are very embedded on their ways. No? So I think it's related with what Nataša was pointing out. There are like moments in which apparent steps are taken, but there are dynamics that are very hard to change. And I've been in big exhibitions in which the curators were like outspokenly saying that for us there is no artists, there are only agents, and we are all the same. And then you finally end up being there with creating a dialogue with pastoralists, and they actually make a completely huge, let's say, a difference and a differentiation between the pastoralist and the super well-known artist. So it's part of the behaviors we have learned to work with, the exchanges of cultural capital, the status, and many things that we need to be very related also with the supremacists that Suzanne was talking about. So that's something we need to kind of be very aware and reprogram in the very self. So I would think creating spaces for direct experience and long-term durational forms of dialogue as well.
And so just one last point on that is just to understand that, when we started 10 years ago challenging the markets, that to imagine that we were in the place now where the Bank of England is calling for the divestment from carbon it's something we couldn't imagine. So thinking about that futurism and how powerful that futurism is to reimagine markets, to rethink about that. And that starts with something that seems impossible, and we're in that now. So also thinking about gains that we've had already that seemed impossible, so that we can know that we can do that in the future.
Thank you very much. We have some questions in the chat. Inga and I can jump in at any moment. Taru, please feel free also to address some of the questions that you couldn't in the short time conversation that we had in the first part. So also feel free to jump in. And of course,
and also I'm thinking if, for example, like now Victoria Bardaku, would you like to ask the question? Like, come, we would like to see you with the camera, and you can ask the question yourself, or would you like us to just read it?
Hi, just a second to set my camera on. There I am.
Hi, Victoria.
Hi. My question was for Suzanne. I was just wondering because she mentioned that it took her quite some time to talk about tar sands after she was exposed to them. And I was wondering what was that moment or that thing that made her actually talk about it, and what happened in that year of silence. Those were my questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I did literally talk about it, and I think this is about these different ways of communicating. So, I talked about the scientific impacts, the financial impacts, the legal impacts, but in terms of in a deep way of being able to, it was almost like a cognitive dissonance. I couldn't understand how people would know this was happening and they couldn't be moved to take action. So it was on a kind of soul, spiritual level that I couldn't reconcile who we were as a civilization or what I was as a human being for that to be the case. So I think it's something that keeps coming up at these different ways of speaking. And I knew I could talk to Shal about the financial risk, the scientific implications, but where do you find spaces to talk about how your soul hurts, how it's questioning how you existentially feel as a human being. And that came through working with the Social Sculpture Research Institute in Oxford, who are really influenced by the work of Boyce. And that's where I started integrating some more of the psycho-spiritual aspects, dealing with the grief. I think that's come up in the questions as well, of processing that grief for myself and understanding that even if I spoke from a spiritual, existential, philosophical place, the analysis that I had of the financial implications, the legal implications still held true. So I think that's really something about being interdisciplinary together, but also healing those modes, speaking within yourself as well. Thanks for the question.
There's also a question from David Habets, just trying to persuade him to show up on the screen so we can see him. But if not, I can read the question too. David?
I can show up,
Please, David. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. And it is a bit a follow-up question on Victoria. So in this silence, I think the physical reaction you have to devastation is really impactful, and the mental health crisis that we're already in since the 90s is ever growing. Climate change will only make it worse. So how can the arts actually play a role in the relief of pain and grief that we'll be facing the coming decades? That was my question, sort of general to everybody. And maybe it is a similar role as religious communities have played in the past. So I'll add that as a subtopic.
I thank you, David, for the question. It just relates to what we were also saying a little bit during our breakup and also now. For example, just to give you a real, just one concrete example is that I talked about one member of the initiative who is Kati Tutayasu, who was formed as a shaman and who exercises actually, her practice is being healing actually the others through communicating with plants, with trees, with spirits. But she also considers her art, her practice as art. So she says it's art of caring. Her art of healing is art of caring. And she produces sound pieces that I think are, being a curator, having been indoctrinated by the very inclusive contemporary art discourse, this sound pieces could be very much put aside the sound pieces of the very established artists that we know. So I think there is in this understanding of healing, I think you're right in saying, I mean, there are certain religions have that function, let's say. So I understand that not only but I think in the pandemics, those that had access to films, books, who could have time. Actually, it was a luxury to have time, and it's a luxury for those that are privileged. But the art kept coming back as a kind of thank God we have that for those that had the luxury of time and that were not essential workers or at the front lines. So I think it's already there. It's not that it can relieve, it's already relieving us without us actually paying attention and noticing that actually when we go to see exhibitions, when we interact with the artists, when we create, it's already a process that it enables us to sustain ourselves mentally, physically. Drawing is a gesture. It's a bodily practice. So all this somehow, I think it's related to thinking how can we put this into practice together with the questions of climate urgency in the sense of talking about carbon footprint, transforming the art systems so that they become inclusive and they say, well, actually, what you are seeing is art, and not like how Fernando said, then there was the division between what pastoralists do, who are sustaining life, and they're doing this in an artistic way, and what an artist does in a studio.
Yeah. Does Fernando also would like to say something on that?
How you know?
Yeah.
Before I even starting to be connected through the screens. No, but I like the question. I was just you allow me to think out loud. First, the aspect of mourning and the aspect of overcoming pain and so on is there. But this is a function that we as cultural beings develop also in relation to other emotions, also maybe like hope or maybe like contempt or I don't know. Let's see what is needed in each moment. What I mean is that how can good art somehow transfer that, in the sense that I think that in the past, these maybe cultural beliefs that mobilized all the societies were more ideologies, no? And then ideologies and worldviews mobilized artists. Those were the commissioners. Let's say that if you were a peasant in the Middle Ages and you went to a chapel and then you saw suddenly like a huge wall paint of the apocalypse, then you will start to think differently and adopt values and so on. So I'm not so sure that artists they are in the position to frame those worldviews and ideologies. No? I wonder, but the problem is that we have inherited the super specialization of art and cultural production in a few, in the very few that have been authorized to be and to have a voice, like here, me now, to tell about art or I'm an artist. But that has deprived many of the people to the possibility to say, okay, actually, I could have cultural expressions myself. And I think that the binding, let's say the binding cultural ritual now of overcoming, for example, pain and suffering is consumerism. And the feeling that you're part of that. So, and then consumerism actually uses very well artists to make publicity. So as a designer, as an artist, I would be making much of it alive, like just thinking how my symbols and aesthetics could sell a car better. But yeah, so just to say that maybe we're expecting too much into it.
Yeah, thank you. We also have Ellen Rogers with next two questions, unless someone else wanted to comment on the previous ones.
I think Suzanne?
Just briefly, specifically on ecological grief, going back to the example of the tar sands, that, when we walked through the tar sands, afterwards there was a space for us to do sweat, to detox the physical accumulation of toxins, but also to go through that process of grief so that we can keep going. So I think that's also important to understand that with a lot of cultures and communities that are working in that level of devastation, there are ceremonies or rituals. We laugh a lot. There's a lot of humor to move through that. So I think understanding those cultures that exist. And also then with the pandemic, what happened for me, I think, was understanding that the way I approach research with climate change has been integrative. So scientific understanding, ancestral knowledge. And I did the same when I had the virus. I was dreaming the biochemical structure of the virus. I was getting dreams of what traditional medicines to take. And I've been taking care of some of my family as well in that. So I think the point of research is really important, again, to bring that relationship and to bring those disciplines back into yourself to be able to navigate the grief and mirroring what we've learned from climate change and the pandemic as well can be interesting.
Yeah, I heard also that Paulina would like to react, and I wonder if it's to this question or if it could. Yeah, okay, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I was just
go ahead, please.
Thank you. Very shortly say that when dealing with such great losses, first as an artist, being a member of that community which is experiencing that loss, or being outsider, first thing is to take care of your own mental health and stability. But secondly, that the community-specific or site-specific work that I have been doing is that's very simple. Medicine is there to increase the sense of joy and increase the sense of being alive and increase the living. When you are seeing and mapping the destruction, it is imperative and very vital to always find the living part. And my community, my traditional community, is from the very similar moon landscape, kind of a landscape, what you, Suzanne, shared with about the tar sands. Mine is about nickel mining. And the thought that even in time, even the time span would be hundreds of thousands of years, the land will heal, has been crucial for me to be able to stay functioning. And when I'm able to be functioning, I'm able to go into my communities and the communities nearby and strengthen the small clips of living, the sense of living with the children, working with the children, working with the elders, and working with the similar ages. And when we are able to grab on that okay, there's something alive in us, there's something alive in the environment still there, then our mental health and capacity to function starts to recover. And that's the first step of getting that subjectivity back when you, as a being, and your land has been target and object for such violent acts.
This is beautiful comment about this joy of living. And so yeah, like Ellen Rogers, you had two questions, the burning ones, so please.
So we started talking about this in the breakout room. As artists, we are, or at least my point of view is, we are dependent on elites in terms of selling our work, donors for activist work, grants to simply live or go to residencies. And how can we move away from that? Because the donors are these elites who are entrenched in our current power system, our current capitalist economy. How do we free ourselves from that so that we are not biting the hand that feeds us, or worse, censoring ourselves so our art is not attacking people who maybe we will rely on in the future? That's question one. And the second is, as artists, how do we decrease our carbon footprint? I live in the United States, which is very large. If pre-pandemic times, I had a show in California that requires a 6-hour flight to get there to a show. Or if I'm not going, my artwork has to go. I'm a sculptor, so that's expensive. Sometimes I work large. There's all that transport. Do I simply choose a different media? Do I not go to shows? How do I get my work out if I'm not showing in some way? Which leads me to thanking Jan van Eyck Institute for putting this on Zoom, because I could never have traveled to the Netherlands to participate. And I would not have wanted to fly for a 3-day conference. So anyway, back to the questions, if anyone has comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel I could answer at least a few. Thank you, Ellen. It's really obviously burning questions, not only for you, but for, I would say, everyone, not only in arts, but scientists and so forth. I would just go with what Suzanne was saying, that 10 years ago, what they were imagining to happen, and it happened in 10 years' time, about the participation of global pollutants and divestment from their education into sponsoring culture and art is, and this is just 10 years. It's not even 50 years, it's 10 years. So I would say it really has to start with you. It just has to start with you. If it means that in order for the sculpture not to, and I'm sorry because this is, but if the sculpture cannot travel and you cannot travel, I mean, either you take time and you go with the train. It is less carbon footprint than the air travel. So I think that the notion of time will be really, really key in the next 10 years. The sort of immediacy that we get, of course, through online, but we have not even thought for a moment what it means for us to be able to be online. What does it mean, this computer that I'm holding in my hands? Where do the coltons and the golds in it and all other rare earth material that make it be online are coming from, and who has labored in order that they are there? All these questions are really, for me, are really important. And they start with speaking about it, considering what are the alternatives that exist in the current situation that I could use. It requires a different time implication indeed. So maybe the sculpture can travel with, on a boat that goes with on wind and not on gasoline, and it takes time. And when somebody starts, maybe 10 other people will follow you, and then 10 other groups of artists and curators will come together and create an organization around that, etc., etc. So I'm also winking to Fernando, of course, with this. But so these are all kinds of steps that you can do from today onwards. So it's really possible. And about how to and this in this interdependent way. I mean, and interdependence is something that we hear a lot now since pandemics, especially. But it's such an old term, right? Those that are maybe Buddhists among the members of the audience here know that this is the key term for Buddhist practice, where it's kind of acknowledging the realms of existences that are there and to which we are indebted to be alive, And so I would just say that if it comes in little drops, it's like seeping through the cracks. I love this metaphor, seeping through the cracks, and it's the cracks will open.
I might follow on a little bit from that, just on the divestment point. I think it's about choosing the battles. For instance, with BP, the amount of money that they were giving was tiny. So, how much actually was at a loss from challenging their investments in terms of what they were getting back from the social license to operate. So I think also working in a coalition, you don't have to do everything. There are other groups, say for instance, that are trying to get shell out of institutions. So how do you work with them? And then sometimes thinking about, how much are you going to get out from that, and being a little bit of a trickster. I work a lot with trickster energy. So if you can take a grant and you can redistribute it, and you can work in collaboration to get those resources to somewhere else. I'm not saying we can clean money, but I think it's also thinking about that. And then the other point around the ecological footprint, again, I think choosing your battles. I got so much violence from flying to Canada to go and witness the tar sands from hardcore climate activists, but I knew I had to go. I had to be on the land, I had to be on the territory. So choosing when we fly, choosing when we make that decision, and understanding the sacrifice and the gravity of a flight as well. And the other thing is, I think, rethinking the forms. I think that's, I was working a bit with the Serpentine, and we're doing the pavilion again. It's like, but what does the pavilion need to actually be at this time in London when you have an air crisis and a pandemic? Maybe it's a hospital and a food bank. So, rethinking the forms completely, so that and also not becoming too on our individual consumption, so militant on that we don't see the humanitarian care possibilities as well.
Maybe I could jump in here a little bit, to kind of, and to sort of feed in something from our earlier discussion within the group, because I think what's been emphasized here as well is the kind of alliance building and the necessity to kind of collaborate. And we were also discussing this question of, or kind of need to recognize how within different structures, whether it's in the arts institutions and the art world or in activism, there are particular hegemonic structures of power that are very violent and exclusive. But there are also different possibilities. There are spaces and structures and practices that we can really learn from each other to actually, and to really invest and kind of build on those that we have, and kind of really, and possibly also bring some of these practices and spaces together to form those bigger alliances and kind of collective sort of a force and volume that can then really change things in a way that takes also the pressure away from the kind of individual and moves on to kind of actually really being able to challenge bigger institutional structures. And so this is also to kind of, as a part response to Katja Anton's comment and question in the chat now about this sort of emphasis on how the institutions have to change, and there has to be a kind of, it cannot be left to the artists, obviously, or individual practitioners. Thank you. Maybe it's Fernando. Do you wanna? Yeah, go.
Well, super short, because I wanted to share a concept we have been working these years with a series of let's say allies and partners and comrades projects that are the Confederación of Villages. People like Rise del Arts, people like Casa del Arte in Casa de la Agricultura in Castiglione, or other projects all around. There's also the network Lumbung that is bringing together interesting groups working on the field. And what I think about this notion of usefulness is that our work would be rewarded, and also materially, if we need that to pay the bills, because we fulfill the needs and the expression of what is of use now within a context, the context we work. So it's also moving out from oligarchic commissioning and to this French idea of the nouveau commanditaire. It's to rethink, like who we would like to say, okay, this is what I can offer, and is it of use? And it will be a process of validation. Maybe at some point it's like, okay, maybe I just have to paint at my home in my free time and do good bakery work instead. It's fine. But this is more useful.
I would like just to read out Katja Garcia-Anton's comment, so it's registered on video, and since Taru made a reference to it. So in response to Ellen's question, both artists and institutions together have to be complicit to catalyze that change. So time is inbuilt into slow travel for physical presentations, or digital, virtual, or other forms are used, where the journey and the time itself is part of the project and audience connecting along the way. So presentation is not venue specific even, but it's a mutual project. It cannot be left up to the artist alone. Thank you, Katja. And we have about 15 minutes to wrap up. And so that we can go back to our object of discussion and to warm up for the assembly tomorrow, I'd like to ask the speakers if they could think what is a message that you would like to give or ask or express to the group of the future in tomorrow's assembly. And then for the attendees online, maybe you can write your own suggestions or questions or comments on the chat so we can also keep track on that and maybe include it in the conversation tomorrow. And then after that, we will wrap up. Taru, please.
Okay.
Take it away.
So we thought that we would all kind of chip in here rather than me representing us. I think 4 people representing the present is already quite a stretch. So maybe and I think we decided to also be quite informal about this because it's been kind of a conversation that has really been feeding our thought as we've been going along. So these points that we'll all raise are more maybe something to take with us for tomorrow. That will hopefully be already something completely different will come out of them while we follow the discussions today later on. Who would like to, who's the brave person from the present group to go first with? What is your burning question or kind of, or thoughts that you want to pass on to the future? I can say the obvious. That what is it like when you look out the window? I think that is the burning question for all of us, that have we left the livable world behind us or not?
And following on from that, go ahead.
Sorry, Suzanne, please. No, please.
I think, I got 2. What do you wish we knew now? What do you wish we knew now that you know now? So yeah, just something that they wish we knew. And also, what does the work look like that we did to get to the future? What were the forms of care and labor that, especially specifically after the pandemic, as we created this ecological future, that we were still there. So yeah, I'm really interested in what the work looks like that we did to get to the future.
I would just echo Suzanne in that and Taru already, and to say what, in that sense, a bit, kind of typical human question, like what is it remaining from what we have today and what we are trying to achieve to change the art system. What did it remain from that endeavors? What did it remain from us trying to understand our non-human environment better and trying to understand it as a sentient being? What did it remain of that? And yes, and how do you look at art where you are right now?
Well, if I would have to pose a question to our IPACC equivalents in 40 years, let's say, I would ask, how did it work out? How did you manage to maybe slightly influence IPACC to be just a consultative body or influencing body to become a social movement, and which imaginaries and aesthetics drove the extension of that IPACC to become a sort of a committee of confederal networked cells of change, direct change, and direct democracy.
I think I could also add to that, sort of riffing off yesterday's last night and then our conversation that just now of kind of how, the question of optimism, of kind of how do you keep hold of hope at these times. And I think that's, in the future, from the future perspective, how have we, because of course, if hope has been lost, there is nothing there in the future for us to kind of engage with anymore. So what are those kind of modes and possibilities of hope and optimism that get us through to the future that is livable?
Thank you so much. The future is listening. Some of the future members are listening, so they will definitely prepare for those questions. I think we can, just looking at the chat, Inga, do you want to add something before we go to break?
Yeah, no, I think it was a very beautiful wrap up, and I really like the hope, optimism, and joy which we had to wrapping up this session, because in the yesterday's session we had also quite dystopian visions of like when we spoke about the possibility of forests being extinct and much more also realistic, like that the future is already here in the present, which of course we also saw in Suzanne's presentation about the tar sands. So yeah, I think it's really interesting and valuable and important to try and balance those two, this kind of realization how serious the ecological crisis is, and then also to not, instead of getting into this grief, how we can find these joys and hope and wish to actually work on that and work together and change our attitudes and habits and and especially now when we are in some sort of social isolations within our homes and also within our countries. And but then this event then seems like a really good moment to connect. So yeah, that's it from me. I think we can transition.
Yes. So thank you so much, Taru, Fernando, Suzanne, Nataša. We'll meet you again, but you're invited, of course, to stick to the conversation in the afternoon.